Hey, welcome back, everybody. We are ready to get back into our study here on consciousness. We're now on part 2 in our series, and we're going to cover a lot of material today. Everything from the interaction problem, what matter is, quantum physics, Panpsychism, idealism, and more. So get ready for a very interesting conversation. One of the objections often raised against substance dualism is the language of their arguments. For example, you'll hear or read substance dualists say something like this: if we are just atoms and molecules, how do we have conscious experience? If we are just our brains, we're just this and we're just that, and so forth. Some say it's a weak argument to say consciousness can't just be the firing of neurons. Because what happens when the day comes and science discovers that consciousness is just the firing of neurons? What if they discover the physical mechanism that makes matter conscious? Or perhaps we've been looking at this all wrong because we are clinging to old ideas about what matter is. Maybe it's not spirit or mind that is the problem, but our concept of physical matter. See, we always think about, well, there can't be any spirit because all we see is physical, but maybe what we're seeing really isn't physical or as physical as we thought. So if that's the case, let's examine what matter actually is and see if consciousness can be constructed from this. So what is matter? According to dictionary.com, matter is physical or corporeal substance in general, whether solid, liquid, or gaseous, especially as distinguished from incorporeal substance, as spirit or mind, or from qualities, actions, and the like. Something that occupies space. We've all heard that one. A particular kind of substance. The dualism in these definitions is based on outdated science. It is assumed in the above definition that spirit or mind doesn't occupy space, so therefore it is ontologically different from matter. But we see countless examples in the Bible of spirit beings operating in our physical reality. So it seems that spirit can occupy space. Also, the definition of matter also mentions it is a particular kind of substance. What the substance is, we don't know, of course, but it isn't all that different from matter, and it can interact with matter, contrary to what skeptics say who think the interaction problem is the nail in the coffin for substance dualism. When theologians talk about the nature of spirit, they usually invoke such language as invisible, unbounded, immaterial, mind, or intangible. In truth, these terms could all be applied to matter. I know that sounds crazy, but just follow me on this. For example, the elementary particles that make up atoms are invisible until they are observed. So, in a sense, matter is immaterial until it is observed. It may also surprise many to know that matter is basically empty space. It's more like spirit than we ever imagined. In a sense, we could say that matter is immaterial because there really isn't much to it. It takes up space, but not a lot of it. To demonstrate just how immaterial matter is, consider that if we could blow up an atom to the size of the Earth, the nucleus would be a basketball in the center of the Earth, with the electrons way out in the atmosphere, and everything in between would be empty. Think about that. As Gerald Schroeder stated, if we could scale the center of an atom, the nucleus, up to 4 inches, the surrounding electron cloud would extend to 4 miles away, and essentially all the breach between would be marvelously empty. The solidity of iron is actually 99.99999% startlingly vacuous space made to feel solid by ethereal fields of force having no material reality at all. Now, did you see that? Force having no material reality at all. According to Brian Greene, if the Empire State Building could be shrunk to eliminate all the free space between the atoms and all the free space within the atoms themselves, it would be the size of a grain of rice. Can you imagine the Empire State Building being the size of a grain of rice? So when we think of something being solid, we must realize that there really is no such thing. Solidity is an illusion brought on by invisible, immaterial forces at the atomic level. Like charges repel, So this repulsion or charges is what gives the impression something is solid. The reason our hand slaps a table has nothing to do with the material or substance of the table. Rather, the atoms in our hand interact with the atoms of the table and repel due to like charges. We hear a slap and can even feel pain in our hand, but in truth, our hand never really touches the table. But all of this takes place in our consciousness. All of these charges of repulsion and the physical processes going on out there create an inner conscious experience. Remember this as we progress through the video. It's a very important point. Now, the last sentence in the above Gerald Schroeder quote is vitally important to the thesis of this video, so it bears repeating and explaining. Stated another way, solidity, which has long been considered one of the distinguishing features of matter, is the result of invisible forces that have no material reality. Now, he uses the word ethereal because the fields that create the force lack any material substance. Max Planck, considered by many the father of quantum mechanics, also said concerning this, "As a man who has devoted his whole life to the most clear-headed science, to the study of matter, I can tell you as a result of my research about atoms this much. There is no matter as such." Think about that. There is no matter as such. All matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force, which brings the particle of an atom to vibration and holds this most minute solar system of the atom together. We must assume behind this force is the existence of a conscious and intelligent mind. This mind is the matrix of all matter. Again, we see that matter only exists by virtue of a force. And remember, forces have no material reality. The forces that create the repulsion or attraction are the result of virtual particles. And these virtual particles, they pop into existence for less than Planck time, which is 10 to the minus 43 seconds, which is the smallest unit of time possible. So they really don't even exist. This force, along with all forces and energies that animate our reality, according to Planck, are the power of God's thoughts. So God's thoughts supply the power to make everything happen in our universe, according to him. Now, what could possibly lead him to this conclusion? Well, to answer that, let's do a quick dive into the quantum world, the subatomic realm. Now, atoms are by no means the end of the story when it comes to the smallest constituents of matter. In the 1960s, physicists discovered that the protons and neutrons that make up atomic nuclei are actually made up of smaller bits of matter called quarks. We would have to shrink to 10 to the minus 18 centimeters to enter the realm of these elementary particles. Now, to give you an idea of how small quarks are, think of an electron being 1 centimeter long. A quark, in comparison, would be the size of the thickness of a single hair. Anything smaller than a quark has not yet been discovered, and it is here where string theorists take the baton. Many physicists believe that quarks and other subatomic pieces of matter could be more accurately described as a tiny filament of energy that vibrates and looks like a string. According to string theorists, electrons, quarks, and all of the pieces of matter that we assume are point-like particles are actually not points, but strings. If we had powerful enough microscopes to see that small, string theorists claim that the higher resolution would reveal a tiny string that is wiggling and vibrating. String theorists claim that all the properties of elementary particles like mass, spin, and charge are really just different frequencies from vibrating strings. These strings are one-dimensional and are about 100 billion times smaller than an atomic nucleus. For this to make sense, think of an atom enlarged to the size of the entire solar system. Right now, that's our sun and all planets. Imagine an atom getting that big. A string would be no larger than a tree on Earth. That's tiny. Now, panpsychists need to ask at this juncture why proto-consciousness has not been discovered as a fundamental property of the subatomic world if matter is indeed imbued with some form of consciousness. Why does charge, mass, and spin so readily show up in observations and experiments, but proto-consciousness doesn't? If it's such a ubiquitous property in the universe, why do we not see it? Furthermore, how does a pre-conscious property show signs of conscious potentiality if it's not conscious to begin with? And how would we identify a property as proto-conscious if it isn't conscious? Right? How would it betray itself and say, hey, I'm conscious? If matter has potential for consciousness, if it's arranged in a complex way, then the ingredient to form that consciousness should still reveal itself, would it not? Now, is string theory the end of the road? Can we go even smaller and cut these strings in half to see what they are made of? Is there a point where matter cannot be divided into smaller parts? Well, Brian Greene, in response to this question, says there are two possible answers to the question. First, strings are truly fundamental. They are atoms, uncuttable constituents in the truest sense of the ancient Greeks. As the absolute smallest constituents of anything and everything, they represent the end of the line, the last of the Russian Matryoshka dolls, in the numerous layers of substructure in the microscopic world. Using our linguistic analogy, paragraphs are made of sentences, sentences are made of words, and words are made of letters. What makes up a letter? From a linguistic standpoint, that's the end of the line. Similarly, a string is simply a string, as there is nothing more fundamental. It cannot be described as being composed of any other substance. Some physicists believe that strings are really not the end of the road. There is a possibility that the strings could be made from even smaller ingredients. If this is the case, what are we left with once we've cut the strings into nothing? The latest idea is that when we get to the smallest of scales and want to see the very fabric of space-time, what you see is a membrane alive with all kinds of activity. Physicists began to realize by the 1990s that there was more to string theory than just tiny one-dimensional strings. The mathematics revealed that there are multi-dimensional membranes. The one-dimensional membranes could be thought of as the strings of string theory. However, there are two-dimensional branes, three-dimensional branes, and on it goes all the way up to 10 spatial dimensions. Add the dimension of time, and you have an 11-dimensional universe. This latest idea is called M theory. And of course, nobody agrees on what the M should stand for, so most go with the word matrix. According to this idea, the universe is actually a membrane suspended in a higher dimensional existence and is one among countless other parallel universes. Amazingly, these parallel universes could be less than 1 millimeter away, yet you can never reach out and touch it. Everything, including light, is bound to this matrix and has no chance of escape. According to M theory, all the elementary particles that we observe in our universe are the endpoints of strings. The other part of the string exists in the other dimensions. It makes you wonder, what's on the other end of the string in those other dimensions? Closed strings, it is thought, are not bound to our membrane and can seep out of the universe, which to physicists explains why gravity is such a weak force compared to the other forces of nature. But if this is possible, then why is it impossible to think that spirit or mind could seep into our membrane universe from the spiritual realm to interact with the physical universe? Is it crazy to think that perhaps the membranes where these strings are vibrating is the boundary of the physical universe that exists in a higher dimensional spiritual plane? It's possible. Do we know where these membranes came from? This membrane is where elementary particles exist. Now watch this, in wave form, immaterial waves, before they pop into existence. We've been taught to think of matter as little pieces of solid point-like particles. In chemistry class, remember, you saw the model of the atom and there were electrons circling the nucleus like planets orbit the sun? This model of the atom that showed point-like pieces of matter is now considered outdated. Science changes. We learn more and more as we go. So what they think now is that electrons and other elementary particles actually exist in an invisible wave and are spread throughout the entire universe until an observer makes the wave collapse to present a particle. As we probe deeper into the atom and examine the ingredients that are used to construct them, it becomes increasingly apparent that an intelligent mind created them. The smaller we shrink and the closer we get to the very substance of space, the more aware the universe seems to be. One of the fascinating discoveries to come from studying the subatomic realm is a strange phenomenon called the observer effect. The way elementary particles behave reveals that some intelligent mind must have programmed them with the ability to know when they are looked at. Like sensors on floodlights that can be triggered by someone's presence, God created particles of matter with sensors, so to speak, to know when they are observed. Now, how do we know this? Well, the double-slit experiment is one way we know this. The double-slit experiment is a famous experiment that reveals this strange behavior of matter responding to observation. When physicists fire electrons through a screen with two slits, they expect two lines to form on the detector screen behind it. This reasoning seems logical, right? Because we would see that result if we fired marbles or BBs through a screen with two small slits. But there's a huge difference between firing big pieces of matter, relatively speaking, like marbles, and firing incredibly small bits of matter like electrons. Electrons don't behave like big pieces of matter, like a BB or a marble. The subatomic realm does not follow the same rules as the macro world, and can be rather spooky, as Einstein labeled it. The results of the experiment actually show more than two lines on the detector screen, which doesn't make any sense because you have two lines, you would expect, two lines on the detector screen. But this means that the electrons went through both slits at the same time as a wave. When physicists discovered that a particle could travel through both slits at the same time, they decided to put a measuring device by the slits to see if they could catch the particle in its ghost-like state. Every time they went to observe what was happening, the wave property of the particle collapsed and formed a point-like particle. In other words, the electron or photon leaves as a particle, travels as a wave, but will manifest as a particle when a conscious being observes it or the particle interacts with something. Brian Greene wrote concerning this, "Particle properties come into being when measurements force them to. When they are not being observed or interacting with the environment, particle properties have a nebulous, fuzzy existence characterized solely by a probability that one or another potentiality might be realized." Now, you might be puzzled over how electrons or other elementary particles can behave as a wave. Most of us were taught that electrons, protons, and other elementary particles exist as point-like particles or little balls of matter. It is now believed that these elementary particles exist as some kind of wave in a quantum ocean. Again, Brian Greene talks about this. He goes, "Thus, the success of quantum mechanics forces us to accept that the electron, a constituent of matter that we normally envision as occupying a tiny, point-like region of space, also has a description involving a wave that, to the contrary, is spread through the entire universe." So electrons and other elementary particles go from not occupying a region of space by being spread throughout the entire universe, which sounds a lot like descriptions of spirit, right? Or mind. It goes from that to occupying a region of space. The next obvious question is, what is this wave that is spread throughout space? The waves are mathematical descriptions of something that has no material reality. Physicists don't know what these waves are. They don't know what they're made of because the waves will not allow anyone to see them. Now, what they do know is that whatever this stuff is that is waving, it's not made up of the ingredients that make particles. The particles don't take on the substance of these waves and then manifest. In a truly miraculous fashion, the particles composed of entirely different ingredients pop into existence out of this waving field only when they are observed, like they were created for mind. There are several phrases that have been adopted over the years to describe these waves. It's common to hear like universal field, field of intelligence, superstring field, and so forth. But the point is, there is so much we don't understand about reality, and we all, materialist, dualist, idealist, whatever you claim to be, we all assume way too much in these conversations about consciousness. Dualists assume too much when they say just matter, as if matter is nothing. And physicalists assume too much when they think consciousness could emerge from unconscious bits of matter, because that's what they think matter is. Maybe there is a place in the middle, though, where matter is not just matter, and the idea of spiritual substances and energies is not so far-fetched. Now, admittedly, not all physicists buy into the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is what we were just talking about, where elementary particles have no physical reality until they are observed. That's the Copenhagen interpretation, and there are others. However, it's the view held by the majority and the view taught in most textbooks. But what we could learn from this, maybe, is a fundamental truth about reality. Namely, God created it for conscious beings. If there is no God, then how or why the universe was set up as a stage for consciousness makes no sense. Now, idealists would speak up here and say, hey, wait a minute. That sounds a lot like what George Berkeley said. You know, the father of idealism, or modern idealism. Yes, Berkeley did say that. He did say that reality is a presentment for consciousness, and he was correct. Berkeley also argued that all that exists are minds and ideas, and I think he was correct here as well. Eric Haynes explains this well. He writes, Berkeley is essentially arguing that reality ultimately exists and is connected through God's consciousness. Thus, from Leibniz and Berkeley, one can already begin to see a universal theme in their idealism. This theme is that God, as creator, facilitates a perception of reality in knowing subjects. This manifestation of reality is ultimately done so that spiritual beings, souls or persons, can have a sensible or tangible reality for experience in life. Tangible meaning that God produces for his creatures a reality they can experience through sensations, though this does not require a separate substance or matter. Idealism says the world out there is real. It's not just in our heads, but how we perceive that very real stuff out there, forming the substance of reality, is not how it really is when a conscious being is not interacting with it. Take the technicolor experience away that we call consciousness, and all you really see are forces and small pieces of matter jostling around. For example, when you hold an apple, you are really holding a bundle of information that your consciousness processes as an apple. The apple is an idea in the mind of God, right? God created apples. God said, okay, this is the way an apple is going to be. And for that idea to be expressed in your consciousness, the substance of our reality constructs an apple out of these little bits of matter, what we call matter. You think you're holding the apple, but the apple actually never touches you. The illusion of solidity is just that, an illusion. You think it's solid, but the forces of repulsion that have no material reality, remember, make you think you're holding something solid. And you may describe the apple as smooth, but that is just a mental sensation. We say the apple tastes sweet and has a juicy texture, but all of that is experienced in the mind. The sweet and juicy we experience comes from our consciousness, processing information that's in the matter. The atoms and molecules that make up the apple aren't sweet and juicy, but when they're constructed in the right way, by following the laws of chemistry, our consciousness processes that information as sweet and juicy. So the substance of reality is created for mental interaction. So it appears that our consciousness reads matter and its properties to create our conscious experience. This points to God because it shows that the world out there was created for consciousness, which shows design. Now, one reason to perhaps go with this view is its simplicity, which in philosophy is called parsimony. In other words, why invoke another explanation or substance to account for something when the simplest explanation will do? Why say there is a physical substance out there when God doesn't need another substance? Haynes writes, when applied to metaphysical systems, this principle of pure reason seems to favor the monistic philosophies. Now, modism meaning one substance versus dualism. So Occam's razor provides support in favor of idealism, at least when compared to dualism, since idealism has fewer hypotheses and things postulated. Idealism is simpler because it only has one substance, and thus there is no interaction problem. The idea of one substance or mind being the foundation of reality answers so many questions about how a spirit or a soul or our mind could interact with matter. Well, it can interact because it's not really a different substance. If you think about it, why is an extra substance like a brain needed for the soul to function? Obviously, the soul can think without a brain because we will exist in a conscious state without our physical bodies between our death and the resurrection. But if the soul is immaterial, as commonly taught, does it have an immaterial brain to think? And if the soul can think, then why do we even need a physical brain? If our memories are stored in the brain, does that mean we will lose our memories in this intermediate state? This is where idealists would speak up and reiterate the fact that it is indeed more parsimonious to stick with one substance like mind, rather than bringing in something superfluous like a physical substance. If God could create conscious souls out of a spiritual substance, then why does that spiritual substance need anything more to think or function? Could he not create a soul that could think? Yes. Maybe dualists have been looking at this the wrong way by keeping matter and spirit in separate categories. We have such a limited understanding of what matter actually is. And think about this, do we really think that God calls matter, matter? Do you think God calls atoms, atoms, and that he understands science the way we do? Do you think God describes the elementary particles the way humans do? No, our words and concepts do not adequately describe what reality is made of. The best we can do is observe what it does and how it works. But what it is another story. We need to stop thinking that atoms are just atoms, or physical matter is just physical matter, because there's nothing simple or basic about matter. Even a simple hydrogen atom is an ingenious invention by Almighty God. Just because we know certain properties about matter doesn't mean we have it all figured out. We forget that we are studying a substance, if you can even call it that, created by God. And as such, we can assume it has properties and capabilities we know nothing about. So we need to stop looking down our nose at matter like it's nothing to be impressed with, because it's actually an amazing creation of God. Now, I'll say briefly here before we close that the interaction problem loses its teeth the more we understand the nature of reality. So the interaction problem goes like this. How can a soul or spirit, which is one substance, influence or interact with physical matter, which is another substance, without violating the law of conservation? How are you going to put energy into a system without violating the laws of nature? But if we're not dealing with so many different substances, then this isn't really that hard to explain. The old spirit is so different from matter it can't possibly influence it line won't work anymore. This certainly doesn't align with what we see in the Bible. For example, from Genesis to Revelation, we see God, who is spirit. Remember, Jesus said God is spirit. We see this spirit being manifest in various forms: light, fire, electricity, cloud, and even human form. For light to manifest when God enters a region of space would require the spiritual energy of God to interact with the physical elements around him. That is, after all, how light works. Electrons jump around in different orbits when they receive and give off energy. So God's spiritual energy can interact with electrons. If our soul is a spiritual substance, then why can't it do the same? Also, think about angelic beings in the Bible. They weren't always invisible or immaterial. See Genesis 18, Daniel 6, and Luke 1. They could be touched, and some argue even had intercourse with women to produce offspring. And you could read about this in Genesis chapter 6. So it's hard to make a case that spirit was considered a radically different substance or element from matter. The ancient Hebrews certainly didn't think about it this way. They didn't make a careful distinction. Another thing to consider is the erroneous idea that heaven is a spiritual dimension outside the physical boundaries of the universe. The ancient biblical writers did not have the language, the science, or the philosophical concepts for such an idea. Now, that's not to say that God didn't exist prior to creation in some kind of spiritual reality, but we don't have any idea what that looks like. But what we do know is what God was up to in Genesis. And there we see God setting up the cosmos to be his divine temple, to house his glorious presence. Since God is spirit, we can conclude from this that God created the universe for spirit beings. What we call matter and the smaller constituents that make it up were created by Almighty God to interact with conscious beings. In other words, the pixels of reality were designed to give a first-person experience in color. So, when you think about it, information is driving everything. Everything can be reduced to information. And this information comes from intelligence. The intelligence comes from a mind. So everything starts with mind.